welcome back. We're going to look now at some major issues in contemporary federalism. So we're going to look at three things. The first is, how do we manage federalism? The second is the issue of transfer payments. You probably hear about those transfer equalization payments. And then the third is asymmetrical federalism, or so what do we do about the fact that not all provinces are exactly the same? So let's look at each of these major issues. So the first issue is, how do we manage federalism in Canada? So there's a lot of areas that are covered by both federal and provincial jurisdiction. So things like marriage, immigration, agriculture. So there's definitely key issues of who controls what. So we saw that in the same-sex marriage debate. Is this a provincial issue or a national issue? Can the national government say who can marry in the provinces? Also issues like immigration. For example, Quebec has additional powers in their own immigration system. So a lot of issues are shared. And the main issue with managing federalism is, how do we deal with our shared responsibilities? There's also new issues that really weren't thought about when we divided powers in Confederation. Things like environmental policy. So who should really be taking the lead? If provinces are regulating those industries with high emissions, then should they be taking the lead, or do we need a national strategy because we know that climate change is not going to stop at a provincial border? So that's one of those key issues that provincial premiers and the Prime Minister have to deal with regarding jurisdictional issues. So how do we go about then managing these sorts of issues where things are a little unclear of who does what and who has power where? So the first way that we might go about doing this is what we call intergovernmental relations. And so one thing to remember is intergovernmental relations means federal-provincial relationships, relationships between provincial governments and the federal government as well. So not between different governments in different countries. It's actually between federal and provincial governments. And so there's a whole task of managing these sorts of relationships that exist. One of the ways that they do that is through what we call executive federalism. So the premiers and the prime minister, so not through the Senate or the House of Commons, just the prime minister alone, will meet up together and have first ministers conferences where they will discuss these issues as kind of peer-to-peer. So premiers to premiers, premier to prime minister. And that, of course, causes a lot of sparks and drama whenever they do end up meeting. The other way that the federal government at least has had a way of kind of inserting themselves into provincial jurisdictions is with federal funding. So the idea is, we're going to provide some funding for this thing in exchange for certain regulations. And that's kind of one way that they can get involved in issues like healthcare, for example. The Canada Health Act says, we want to have some standard policies regarding health, and we're going to give you money if you implement them. So it's a way for the federal government to kind of insert themselves into some of these issues that are traditionally provincial affairs. All right, so this issue of managing federalism through first ministers' meetings. So first ministers' meetings, of course, premiers and prime ministers meeting together. So I'm going to send you to a video from the most recent first ministers' meeting in December, and then we're going to come back and discuss a few questions about that. So go pause this. Go take a look at the video, and we'll come back. So welcome back. So let's talk about these questions that we have to consider. So the first is, what are the major policy issues discussed? So one of the biggest ones is the oil crisis. You might have noticed that gas prices are super low these days. I don't think I've ever seen it, since I've owned a car, having it below 90 cents. So the oil crisis is a big deal for a lot of provinces, especially out west. The oil prices have dropped from a 4-year high to a huge low in less than 2 months. Kind of the history of the oil crisis is really complicated, but essentially the idea was that it was artificially high. Previously, Trump had said he wanted to stop importing oil from Iran. And so Saudi Arabia increased production, but then suddenly we had too much oil. And so especially Alberta, but other provinces started to suffer from these lower prices. So that's kind of the major issue that they're talking about in this particular piece, or that they wanted to talk about at that first ministers' meeting. What's the main concern of the premiers? Well, the premiers wanted a say in the agenda. They wanted to know what they wanted to have a say in what was going to be talked about. And so you can see that in this piece, they say that the agenda was made by the prime minister and their ministers, and the premiers were saying, hey, like, we don't want to just get talked at. We want to actually have something to talk about with you. And the premiers, I think, really wanted to appear somewhat in control. I guess the question is that substantive or not? Who knows? Sometimes it looks like these things are just for show, but there's this debate between premiers and the prime minister regarding who's really in charge of this meeting. Are you just going to, as the prime minister, just talk at us, or are you actually going to discuss things with us? So that leads to this question of, well, what's changed since previous first ministers' meetings? So one thing that's changed is that there are more conservative premiers now. There's a liberal prime minister and a lot of conservative premiers. So that causes some tension, obviously. And a lot of this might be, 2019 election posturing. What can the prime minister really do with less than a year left in his mandate? And so in this case, maybe the premiers have a lot more power because they know that the prime minister is gunning up for an election campaign. And especially some of the more conservative premiers might be looking to dent his reputation a little bit. So this sorts of drama happens at most first ministers' meeting. That might be why there weren't a lot of first ministers meeting under the Harper, or weren't first ministers meeting under the Harper regime or Harper era. Whereas the current prime minister has talked a lot about discussing and meeting with premiers, but the question the premiers ask is, are we really actually getting anything done? And so it's just part of the executive federalism that managing a federation is complicated and messy. The second issue that I wanted to talk about is federal transfers or equalization. And I think that's because there's a lot of myths that exist out there regarding equalization or federal transfers. So I'm going to send you to a little CBC radio podcast type thing that talks about equalization. But maybe I'll give you a little bit of a backgrounder first. So under the 1982 Constitution, so when our Constitution got patriated, the Government of Canada has provided financial support to provincial and territorial governments on an ongoing basis. The idea is to help them provide services and programs. So there's 4 main transfer programs. The first is the Canada Health Transfer, which is pretty obvious. It's meant for healthcare funding, so that wherever you are, you get similar levels of healthcare. The Canada Social Transfer, which is for things like post-secondary education, social assistance, social services, early childhood development, for example. Equalization, which is the one that we're probably going to hone in on the most, and then the territorial formula financing. So this is meant for territorial governments to provide public services because things just cost a lot more up in the north to run. Okay, so let's hone in on this equalization. So this is an unconditional transfer, meaning it's not tied to a specific item. The idea is that less prosperous provinces can provide their residents the same sort of public services that are provided in other provinces, so that regardless of where you're living in Canada, you have a right to the similar sorts of services. So the way that equalization payments work is it's all based on fiscal capacity. So the idea that provinces that, so the fiscal capacity is built on this idea of what is your ability to generate tax revenue. And then that is calculated for every province. And then the province that have more fiscal capacity are going to receive less in these equalization payments than provinces that have a higher fiscal capacity or higher ability to generate tax revenues. So a province that does not receive equalization payments, we often call these a have province, whereas a province that does receive equalization payments is what we would call a have-not province. So you probably heard those terms before, and that's what it means. Now, it's important to remember that it is based not on what the tax rates are, how much wealth they have, but the capacity of that province to build to tax. So things like personal income taxes, business income taxes, consumption taxes, national natural resource revenue, property taxes, for example, etc. So as we see in the little radio show that we showed, there's kind of two major myths about equalization. The first is that it is transferring money from one province to another. So the important thing to remember is that equalization payments are funded by the federal government from its own general revenue. So there's no pot that the provinces are contributing to that then gets redistributed. So it is coming out of federal revenue. The second myth is related to this fiscal capacity. So the idea is that it's based on how much a province could raise in terms of revenue, not how much it actually raises. So even if a province has a large capacity to raise revenue and then just doesn't choose to tax, that they're still being given equalization payments based on the capacity they have to raise revenues. So take a look at this radio show. I think it's a really good way of understanding some of the myths and misperceptions about equalization payments. So hopefully you've come back after looking at the radio show. So I guess the question is, why is this particularly funny or poignant? It's this sense that people have had for a very long time, that the West is feeding the cow that is getting milked by Eastern Canada. But this is kind of this common perception of what equalization is and does, is that, it's advantaging or disadvantaging certain provinces based on how wealthy they are or their ability to create wealth. And there's a lot of debate that still ensues about whether that is an appropriate way to distribute these payments. So still something that will always get debated. So the last of the three issues I wanted to talk about was asymmetrical federalism. So that essentially means that not every province is the same, right? Every province has its own kind of unique needs and desires. And even though there's this idea that we want all the provinces to be equal and treated equally, the reality is that there are a variety of issues that, make it important for prime ministers or for the country to deal with provinces differently. So you can see Atlantic provinces, especially back in the late 20th century, needing some extra help, needing extra assistance because they were economically not doing so well. You can see Western alienation. It's like the Reform Party largely came out of, Western alienation, back to that cartoon we just saw, the idea that, a lot of the West felt like it was being left out of central politics. And then, of course, Quebec separatism and Quebec's unique place. So we're going to talk about this really briefly. Oh, and the image didn't show up, but there's an image right here of Brian Mulroney in the Quebec question, but that's okay. So the Quebec question. I think you can't talk about federalism without talking about the Quebec question, and we're going to touch on it very briefly, unfortunately, but Quebec's always kind of had a special place in Canada. It's a special state in Canada, a nation, if you will. Quebec did not actually sign on to the 1982 Constitution. There were 2 referendums on amendments to get Quebec in. There was 2 referendums on sovereignty. And even today, Quebec has kind of a different agreement than the other provinces do. It has control of its own immigration, employment, and pension programs. And has the ability to collect taxes that only the federal government does in other provinces. So, for example, in 2004, the healthcare agreement with Quebec allowed Quebec to set their own goals and review their own processes, whereas all the other provinces had to get the federal government to check in order to receive their healthcare funding. So going back to this constitutional accords, Quebec did not sign on into the 1982 Constitution, and there was some attempts to bring Quebec into this. Both Meech Lake and Charlottetown were meetings that they had to bring about changes to get Quebec to pass in their legislature coming into the 1982 Constitution. So Meech Lake was Brian Mulroney's attempt. The Accord recognizes that Quebec was a distinct society within Canada, also recognized that there's an Anglophone minority in Quebec and Francophone minorities elsewhere, but didn't really go through. Also, the Charlottetown in 92, the idea to bring Quebec into the fold, along with some Senate reform, some national resources reform, and that was defeated in a referendum. So really the Quebec question is one of those perennial questions in Canadian politics, and probably not going anywhere anytime soon, but something very much to think about when we talk about federalism in Canada. All right, so that's all we have for today. So if you head on over to the quiz, you can do the quiz, and we'll see you in class.